Persona 3 is thematically ingenious. I remember playing the original version back in the summer of 2008 and being instantly mesmerized by it. In the years since then, Atlus has released two very impressive sequels. And although most people probably consider Persona 4 and Persona 5 to be the superior games, for me Persona 3 represents the series' pinnacle. The gameplay, story, characters, and music in Persona 3 are deeply impressive, of course, but it's the thematic and esoteric elements that the game explores that make it such a deep and memorable experience. This commentary video is not going to cover story elements in detail, nor will it be a review, but will rather analyze the game thematically and subtextually. So I'm going to assume you've already played the game and understand the various plot elements as written. This commentary will contain spoilers for Persona 3 obviously, but also for Persona 4 and 5 as well, so consider yourself warned. Thematically, Persona 3 incorporates a Jungian treatment of ego and the shadow with various esoteric themes. Actually, all the games in the series do this, but Persona 3 does it best in my opinion. This third installment in the series tracks the progression from societal disillusionment to hearing the quiet voice of conscience, to the maturation of that conscience, to the choice never to forsake truth, however horrific the nightmare of reality might be, to spiritual enlightenment and unmistakable self-knowledge. Two of the key concepts necessary to analyze Persona 3 are ego and shadow, which are frequently misunderstood. Ego is narration of self. It is the story of self, built from those chosen characteristics we typically view as favorable. It is our narrated self that we represent to ourselves and the world. It is therefore an entirely constructed self. Shadow is comprised of those parts of ourselves that we do not incorporate into our narration of self. The shadow is that which is repressed and avoided. Integration of shadow causes the narrated, constructed self to collapse as we realize the story we've told ourselves about who we are is untrue. This is normally a painful process as we ultimately come to realize we've been deceiving ourselves. The process of authentic self-discovery associated with shadow work begins with facing the dark corners of our own soul, those places left out of our own self-narration and obscured in shadow, so to speak. There's a simple scene in the opening few minutes of the game that beautifully outlines this theme visually, wherein our main character is taking the train through the city. In the light of day, he doesn't see his reflection, but when the train enters a tunnel surrounding him in darkness, he sees his reflection. It's thematically meaningful because the egoic self-narration is the part of ourselves in the light that we recognize, but it isn't actually who we are. I look into the darkness and there I am. A beautiful representation of the shadow work. There's a similar scene in the opening minutes of Persona 4 as well. In line with this theme of the hidden truth of shadow underneath the facade of self-narration is the symbology of shooting oneself in the head to summon one's persona. It's not at all dissimilar to ripping off the mask depicted in Persona 5. As Milan Kundera brilliantly put it, on the surface, an intelligible lie. Underneath, the unintelligible truth. In both cases, we are destroying the intelligible lie to reveal the unintelligible truth beneath. That there is a component of violence to this in both cases is very significant. We must be fierce and determined about gathering the will to confront the self-narration with self-honesty and a desire to get at the truth. We must force our way through the self-deception. Our first encounter with the Dark Hour comes within the opening minutes of the game. The Dark Hour is the hidden hour which occurs every day at midnight, experienced only by a select group of people. The Dark Hour is a thematic representation of everything society doesn't include in its own self-narration. The self-narration of the society, of course, is thematically represented by the normal hours of the day. The Dark Hour represents all that is repressed and everything that goes unnoticed by the public. That most people are unconscious during this hour of the day thematically represents that they are not conscious of their shadow material or that of society. Conversely, that certain people retain consciousness during the dark hour thematically implies they are conscious of their shadow and that of the culture. The dark hour is also a thematic representation of those who function independently of the social conditioning. During the dark hour, all of the electronic apparatus of society turns off. The televisions turn off, the cell phones turn off, the news broadcasts fall silent, the guidance systems in the public transit lose power. During the dark hour, there is fundamentally no connection to society at all. Those awake during the dark hour are those who function independently of the social conditioning, which is precisely the reason they come to be cognizant of the cultural shadow. Those people who do not operate independently of social conditioning transmogrify into coffins and are thematically represented as being dead. The game is making the observation that many people are connected only to the society rather than their own heart and are comparable to being dead in the absence of society. There is only social conditioning there, nothing more. In fact, the spiritual teacher George Gurdjieff actually observed that a considerable percentage of the people we meet on the street are people who are empty inside. That is, they are actually already dead. It is fortunate for us that we do not see and do not know it. If we knew what a number of people are actually dead and what a number of these dead people govern our lives, we should go mad with horror. It seems that Gurdjieff was probably making a commentary on people being egotistically connected to their socialized selves rather than being connected to their own heart, but the creators of Persona 3 may have found it a meaningful commentary. It is thematically consistent, then, that citizens around the city who are attacked by shadows during the dark hour, meaning those who are overcome by their own shadow material, having never confronted it, become a kind of undead, quite literally drooling and mumbling incoherently. The game calls this apathy syndrome, a commentary that many people are apathetic, unawakened, and spiritually dead. The game thematically portrays those who do not look inward as a kind of living dead, either walking around in a zombie-like state or literally being inside of coffins. This is very much aligned with George Gurdjieff's commentary. The game also has my favorite depiction of what it feels like to realize that for many of the people around us, the lights are on, but nobody's home. This is also communicated thematically in that many people within the game world are faceless. It artistically communicates that many of the people around us have no identity independent of society. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the game shows us that those stupefied by shadow, as previously mentioned, into a drooling zombie-like state can be restored, but only as the player confronts the various shadow materials that arise during the dark hour. It is by confronting the shadow material of the culture that we are able to help restore the sanity of our peers in society. This is extremely rich thematically and a truly brilliant commentary. It truly is those who explore the shadow side of self and culture who keep society on the path of sanity. Shadow work is ultimately self-honesty, and there are numerous scenes in the game wherein the main characters are honest with themselves about their motivations and who they are. This was also done in Persona 4, although in a much less subtle manner, which was creatively heavy-handed in my opinion. The shadow work is about connecting with the reality underneath the egotistical narrative facade of self. It is thematically meaningful that Tartarus appears at the site of the high school during the dark hour. From the thematic perspective outlined above, we explore the facade of the high school during the day with its social pretenses and constructed belief systems, and then turn our attention to the shadow side of the high school beneath all of the pretense and constructed behavior during the dark hour when the society goes dark. The game humorously represents this shadow side of teenage social interaction as Tartarus, which in Greek mythology is the deep abyss used as a dungeon of torment and suffering for the wicked. A very clever and meaningful social commentary once again on the stark contrast between the outward facade and the inward reality. It is also meaningful that the main character wears earphones during the opening scene. The headphones serve two thematic purposes. The first is to cover his ears. Our main character also has his eyes obscured by his own hair. Since he is awake during the dark hour, he is able to function somewhat independently of society, yet this framing suggests he is still covering his ears and closing his eyes in a manner of speaking. The second thematic purpose of the headphones is to highlight the unique feature of the dark hour, namely that society falls silent. His headphones represent the noise of society, which is continuous with the noise of the sink when we meet Yukari for the first time. Yukari is struggling with breaking through her socialized self to get to her real self as well, and the noise in the sink represents the noise of society and its conditioning. As the scene cuts back and forth, the noise of the sink is meant to be continuous with the noise in the street. When the dark hour begins, however, the noise of society falls completely silent, and in that silence our protagonist first encounters a small child that only he can perceive. The child is a representation of conscience. It is meaningful that our protagonist hears this representation of conscience only when the society falls silent, and the young boy leaves again just as the dark hour comes to an end. Our headphones come back on, symbolizing the reappearance of society, and the fragile beginnings of conscience have disappeared, now drowned out once again by the noise of society. The child directs the protagonist to sign a contract asking him to take full responsibility for his decisions, and reminds him that you can't plug your ears and cover your eyes before disappearing. The contract is a promise to no longer blame other people, leave society and the programming behind, and forge your own path as an independent, autonomous adult, to take responsibility for all of your choices so that your existence belongs fully to you, including all of your mistakes. This is basically the contract of conscience in reality. Having signed the contract of conscience, independence, and autonomy, the protagonist is now able to enter the Velvet Room and meet Igor, both of which are a thematic representation of the soul, our innermost space. Igor's eyes are bloodshot and always open, symbolizing that this part of yourself is always awake, always observing, always present. It is in this velvet room of our innermost self that we craft our personas and find out who we are. It is in this velvet room that the protagonist will later acquire the universe arcana, symbolizing enlightenment, which enables him to overcome death. That the universe is first experienced inside the velvet room is a deeply esoteric theme, speaking to the nature of the human soul. Before the young boy disappears, there is also a brief shot of the child extending his finger to the protagonist. It's a great shot and calls to memory Michelangelo's work in the Sistine Chapel, in which God extends his finger to Adam. A very clever representation of authentic conscience extending itself to us if only we tune the noise of society out and listen. Again, it's meaningful that we encounter this during the dark hour, during which the noise of society has been muted. It is also symbolic that conscience is represented by a child. In Nietzsche's classic Thus Spake Zarathustra, he describes the three stages of a maturing vision. The first is the camel, who carries the belief systems and ideology of a society on his back as through a desert of sorts. The second is the lion, who courageously begins the process of confronting his own belief systems and those of society and critically examining them. The third is the child, who is able to re-examine the world with newly earned unassuming innocence, having left behind the various acculturated belief systems that were previously drowning it out. It is also meaningful that the child later turns out to be of the death arcana, which represents loss and change. Loss of the social conditioning and death of some elements of the socialized self is necessary before we begin to hear the voice of authentic conscience. The shadow work requires that we leave behind the herd and its groupthink and attune ourselves to the heart. It is also deeply meaningful that throughout the first several months, the young boy is only experienced by the protagonist during the dark hour when society falls silent. Later in the game, the boy is represented as a teenager, indicating growth on the part of conscience, and that it is now present outside of the dark hour and joins you at school. Conscience is no longer drowned out by society and can exist outside of the dark hour. Conscience later grows up further and finds the world as a nightmare, and very symbolically offers that you can kill it without feeling bad and you won't have to suffer. And if you choose to do so, the game very symbolically ends as you have chosen senility and surrender rather than the truth. Very meaningful that mature conscience offers you one last chance to kill it and return to those suffering from apathy syndrome. If we choose not to kill the voice of conscience, then we will have to face the destruction of the world, represented by the Death Arcana. This enemy is said to be unbeatable, yet it is defeated when we discover the universe in the game's representation of soul, the Velvet Room. Death is overcome with the rebirth of self following enlightenment. It is our socialized self that dies. Persona 3 also has a group of characters called Strega, a representation of people that operate outside of the social conditioning but who have not done their shadow work and are motivated largely by their wounding. There's a great scene where Strega's leader accuses you of using your power only for self-gain, which is obvious shadow projection since this is basically his own motivation. Persona 4 and Persona 5 both have characters like this as well, people who operate outside the social conditioning but without doing the authentic inner work. They are universally depicted as being socially destructive. In Persona 4, it is Adachi. In Persona 5, it is Akechi. Persona 3 also has a character named Akutsuki, who has a facade of love and light that conceals his inner darkness. Adachi and Akechi are also like this in Persona 4 and Persona 5. They are outwardly nice in the extreme, and it turns out to be a front for inner darkness. The message is clear: don't be fooled by the facade of light that the culture offers you. Do your inner work, or it will consume you and lead to your downfall. Do your shadow work, and don't be confused by the self-narration. Repression of shadow has implications for both individuals and entire societies, as it builds a discontinuity between the surface layer of things and the reality as it actually exists underneath the facade. People generally connect themselves to the more trivial surface layer and ultimately end up connected to nothing substantive, merely the ephemeral platitudes and trivialities of the culture. These are the people who end up blinded and lost, unable to perceive deeper than the surface level of things. The theme of Persona 3, then, is connection with the authentic self rather than the socialized self. Embracing our shadow, transcending the egotistical narration of self, and connecting to the divine. This is why at the outset of the game it counsels us to go forth without falter with our heart as our guide.